Hi there, I'm Emily with the Gulf Council, and this is a public hearing video to get your comments on establishing a Gulf for-hire data collection program. So before we move on to the logistics of the new program, I want to make sure that you know that we heard you. We have worked to update this program and the requirements to ensure that we are reducing the reporting burden on the fleet as much as possible, while still putting up a program that will be useful for science and management. It's a tightrope walk here, right? We don't want to make it harder for you, but we want to also make sure that the information that we gather is going to be used. So we had our ad hoc charter for hire data collection advisory panel meet. They reviewed the original program and they recommended we remove or modify the vessel monitoring system requirement, right? That VMS requirement. We also have modified greatly the economic data collection process that folks did not like in that first program. And then we have also modified our declaration and hail out requirements because there was some sticky issues with that. And so as we go through these actions, I just want you to be clear that they have all been designed around reducing the burden on the fleet while maintaining that scientific integrity so that we can use this for management. So you may know that the recreational sector does have two components, both the private and the for-hire components. Historically, the for-hire component has harvested a substantial proportion of allowable harvest at about 13.6%. And so it's really valuable for us to understand what that fishery is doing. So let's start with some definitions and logistics here. So for the purposes of this document, for-hire vessels are vessels that possess federal Gulf for-hire permits for reef fish or coastal migratory pelagics. Now, charter vessels are typically vessels that do not have a COI to carry more than 6 passengers, while headboats are defined in this document as vessels that are selected to participate in the Southeast Regional Headboat for Survey. So they are selected to participate in that survey based on the fact that they're typically licensed to carry 15 or more passengers, that they are federally permitted, and that they charge primarily by angler. Now, I will make the caveat here that there are some large capacity vessels that are not part of that headboat survey, and those vessels are considered charter vessels. So I also just want to tell you that this new data collection program that we are talking about establishing would put all of these for-hire vessels under the same data collection program. So let's talk about the minimum requirements that we would need in order to have a new data collection program be useful for stock assessments and management. The first one is a logbook, right? We would need to know what you're catching, and that would need to be completed before offload. The next is a dockside intercept component that would allow your logbook and your effort to be validated. Next would be a declaration and landing notification combination. So tell us when you're fishing, when you think you'll be back, and where you're going to be back. We would also need to have approved landings locations. And then you would also have to have a did not fish report. Now, those did not fish reports are only required since we are not considering having some sort of automated validation like VMS or some sort of geofencing that's happening. So the purpose of this document is to improve the accuracy and precision and also the timeliness of our landings and discards and fishing effort data from these federally permitted for-hire vessels. We also want to increase stakeholder buy-in into this program and into data collection. And we want to collect economic information that is related to the operation and costs of maintaining and having a federally permitted for-hire vessel. Now, the need to do this is to improve our management and monitoring of our federally permitted for-hire component of the recreational sector. Okay, so let's jump right into Action 1, which looks at establishing frequency and a mechanism for data reporting. So we'll first focus on timing of reporting. So the longer time period that you have between the end of a trip and when you report is associated with higher uncertainty. So right now, the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey vessels and South Atlantic vessels do have weekly reporting. So it is trip level reporting, but they only have to submit their reports once a week. This is associated with high uncertainty in estimates, and it is difficult to input into stock assessments and use it for management. Now, if you report within 24 hours of a trip, that does allow for less uncertainty, but there will be some recall bias that is associated with these sort of high volumes of landings, or if you're doing multiple trips in a 24-hour period. And then finally, reporting fish before fish are offloaded does really reduce uncertainty, and it also allows for calculation of any missed or non-reporting that might be happening. So next we'll talk about these did not fish reports, right? So having a did not fish report does really improve the accuracy and precision of our effort estimation. And it is used to validate compliance with the logbook requirements, right? So I will say that without this other validation of a VMS or some sort of like location tracking, this did not fish report becomes really important. So the logistics of these did not fish reports is that a fishing week will begin each Monday and go through that following Sunday. There must be submitted by Tuesday after the fishing week. So if you didn't fish all week, by the following Tuesday, you have to submit your did not fish report. And you may submit a did not fish report up to 90 days in advance. So if you know you're not going to be fishing, you can go ahead and submit that did not fish report early, right? If you've planned a vacation, you know you're not going to do anything, you can get it out of the way. You can do it in 90 days in advance, which means if you know you're not going to fish for a long block of time, sit down at your computer, get your cell phone open, and you can do those did not fish reports for that long period of time all at once, and you can basically set it and forget it. So before we jump into the alternatives here, I want to say that this action does not apply to those vessels that are in the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey. Those headboat vessels already have electronic reporting requirements for each trip, but the interval of time at which they have to submit those reports is different, and we will deal with them in action 2. So this action deals only with charter vessels. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative. Essentially what you're saying there, if you select that one, is that this program is not happening. Alternative 2 is the Council's preferred alternative. That would require these federal for hire charter vessels to submit their trip, catch, and effort information for each trip via electronic reporting. Those reports under this alternative would have to be submitted before fish are offloaded. And also, there is a did not fish report requirement that would have to be completed weekly if no fishing occurred. Now, alternative 3 is a little bit different. It would require those federal for hire vessels to submit their trip and catch and effort data for each trip, but they would only have to do it within 24 hours of taking that trip, right? So that gives a longer time interval. And again, under this alternative, you would have to submit those did not fish reports if fishing does not occur within a week. So let's compare the alternatives in this action. So let's talk first about reporting timing. So preferred alternative 2, which would have you report before your fish are offloaded, that reduces the uncertainty of self-reported data, and it also improves the likelihood of capturing any miss or non-reporting that's happening. Alternative 3, which would give you that 24-hour window, might increase that recall bias, especially when we're associating with high volumes of landings or doing multiple trips in a day. So let's see how this interacts with other permits. Vessels that have multiple permits with different reporting requirements are required to comply with the most stringent reporting requirements. So the Gulf program that we are establishing would likely be the most stringent, right? The most strict. And so the South Atlantic for hire vessels currently submit fishing records weekly. This would overtake that. And then there is a proposed rule for HMS vessels that they would have to report certain species within 24 hours. Again, if we choose our preferred alternative, then that would override both of these other permits because you would have to report before offloading no matter what. So when we talk about the did not fish reports specifically and compare those with what's happening, the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey vessels and South Atlantic for hire vessels submit weekly did not fishing reports. So vessels that have both those Gulf and South Atlantic for hire permits would have the same requirements under this preferred alternative. Now, Gulf commercial vessels, as I mentioned, are required to submit monthly did not fish reports. So vessels that have both commercial and for hire permits would have to submit both commercial and for hire did not fish reports. Okay, so let's talk about the nitty-gritty of what the anticipated data fields would look like in that logbook. So first, you'd have to report your actual start time and return time. Second, you would have to report your angler and passenger count. You'd have to give us your crew count. You'd have to do your general area fished and your average depth fished. You would also have to let us know if fishing occurred during the trip. You would have to report individual species data, and you'd have to let us know if you retained or discarded those fish. We'd also want to know your primary gear that was used and your primary target species. Now, what we anticipate for this did not fish report requirement is that when no fishing occurs within a week, you would have to file that weekly did not fish report. This matches the South Atlantic requirements, and the Gulf commercial vessels currently have a monthly did not fish report. So if you have both commercial and for hire permits in the Gulf, you would have to fill out 2 separate did not fish reports. Okay, moving to action 2. So this one deals specifically with modifying the frequency and mechanism of data reporting for those headboat vessels. So again, this action only applies to those vessels that participate in the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey. Currently, they have weekly electronic fishing records that they submit for each trip, and they also have that weekly did not fish report. So as we've discussed, those longer time periods between the end of a trip and the requirement to report is associated with higher uncertainty, and shorter time periods between the ending of the trip and the report may increase the burden on the vessel, right? So we understand that it makes it a little bit more difficult for the fishermen, and we know that the trade-off is that you get better data when you do it quicker. So alternatives here just for the headboats is no action, keep them on that weekly reporting. Or preferred alternative 2 is to require the headboats to submit their fishing reports for each trip via electronic reporting prior to offloading fish. So again, this matches up with what we are doing as a preferred in action 1. Again, if there are no fish caught, then they would have to complete that report within 30 minutes. Alternative 3 would require that daily reporting to happen, so they would have to submit their trip level records daily. So that matches up with the alternative 3 in action 1. This is currently not our preferred. So let's compare these alternatives. So first, the preferred alternative, which would be reporting before offloading, does improve the likelihood of capturing miss and non-reporting. It also minimizes uncertainty that's associated with that recall bias. And we do understand that less flexibility is burdensome, especially during periods of peak activity or even inclement weather. So alternative 3, which is not currently the preferred, it would reduce uncertainty from what we currently have from that weekly schedule, but not as much as the preferred alternative. It would add burden compared to what the status quo is, but again, not as much as alternative 2. But it would not improve the capture of miss and non-reporting. Under all of these alternatives, the did not fish reports would remain unchanged. It would be required weekly like it currently is. Okay, so let's move on to action 3, which considers trip notification and effort reporting requirements. So right now, there is no trip notification required for federally permitted charter vessels. This is necessary to improve the likelihood of intercept validation, right? So it improves effort estimation, it improves validation as compared to the current MRIP phone survey, and it also helps inform law enforcement. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would not create a trip notification requirement. Our second alternative would require federal for-hire vessels to submit a trip notification prior to leaving the dock on any trip where they will be engaging in for-hire fishing or any other for-hire activity. So if there is money being exchanged or compensation being exchanged for the trip, they would have to file a notification. And this would be if those trips were being conducted in marine or estuarine waters. And also it's important that notification would not be able to be submitted more than 24 hours in advance. So if you have a trip tomorrow, you could go ahead and provide your notification, but no further in advance than that. Then we have the options here of doing this for the charter vessels and or the headboat vessels. So alternative 3, which is our current preferred alternative, is similar. However, it would only require trip notification to be filed if the vessel is engaging in any type of for-hire fishing activity. And again, we'd have to choose here if we wanted to apply this to charter vessels or headboat vessels or both. So let's compare these alternatives. So as we said, trip notification provides better estimates of effort. It also improves validation compared to our current MRIP survey and the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey. Alternative 2 does include a trip notification requirement for any chartered activity with paying passengers. This helps us determine the characteristics of the fleet. It would also reduce agency burden. Alternative 3, which is currently the preferred alternative, would only include requirements for for-hire fishing activities, and this would create the least amount of burden on the fleet. So finally, we move to action 4, which looks at establishing reporting for economic data for these for-hire vessels. So economic data can be used for to compare fisheries management alternatives, to allocate disaster relief funds, and to improve science-based management in general. NOAA has indicated that in the absence of completing economic data through this program, it would have to create a whole separate program to collect that kind of data, which is going to be more burdensome and costly for the fleet as well as for the agency. So all vessels participating in the Southeast Regional Headboat already report their economic data for each trip. So this action only applies to those charter vessels that are not already doing it. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would not require economic reporting as part of this program for charter vessels. The second alternative would require for-hire vessels to submit economic data as part of the logbook when they are engaged in any type of chartered fishing or charter activity. Alternative 3, which is the Council's preferred alternative, would also require federal for-hire vessels to submit economic data as part of their logbook when they are engaged in any sort of chartered or charter fishing activity. But it would only be if they are selected. So annually, a portion of the fleet that is sufficient for providing a scientific and management advice would be selected for the year to complete that economic data for each trip. And I think that's about 20% of the fleet, right? So just a portion of the fleet would have to do this each year, but they would have to do it for every trip for the year. So the economic data fields that we anticipate being included in this logbook would be the fee for the trip, the fuel that was used in gallons, and the price of the fuel that is used per gallon. So if we compare alternatives here, both alternatives 2 and 3 are a vast improvement over the status quo since we don't really have anything right now. Alternative 2 would be a census, and it would absolutely provide the most accurate information, but it does increase the burden on the fleet. Alternative 3, which is the Council's preferred, is a survey of a subset of the fleet, and so that is associated with some uncertainty. NOAA does not anticipate sampling more than 20% of the fleet. It would be less burdensome for the fleet as a whole, although it would still be burdensome for that percentage of captains that are selected for the year. So our other permits and how they're associated, well, vessels that have those multiple permits with different reporting requirements, again, are required to comply with the most stringent reporting requirements. The headboat folks are already giving economic data for every trip, so this wouldn't change things for them. And then the South Atlantic does require all vessels to report economic data on every trip. So in this case, the South Atlantic, under our preferred alternative, South Atlantic would have more stringent reporting requirements than the Gulf. So the council plans to take final action on this during their August meeting. We would like to hear your thoughts before taking final action, and you can do that in a couple of ways. You can go to our online comment form and give us a written online comment. You can also just email us at gulfcouncil@gulfcouncil.org, and we'll make sure that we got your comments rolled in and presented to the council. If you scan this QR code, you can find all of the materials that you need in order to get those comments submitted. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and send us your thoughts.